Hello everyone, today we talk about Venetian domestic policy in the mid-14th century and the the attempted coup led by the Doge Marin Faliero. First of all, I'm really glad to discuss Venetian history, which we haven't done so often, right? We got pretty thorough about the Italian communes at large. I think that are a massively, as inexplicably underrepresented polity in polities, because there were basically 30 city-states, as you know, in the current historical pop cultural landscape. There is literally at some point to make some examples of even major battles, major topics that are literally not even one of the major channels, or anyone for that matter, having really made a video about on YouTube, which is insane. And even within those, because we made lots of videos about Italian communes, Italian communal warfare and beyond, we didn't instead take in consideration what is basically one of the possibly only representations of Italian communes in the broader pop awareness. Venice does not require any presentation. Of course, Venetian history is quite famous for a number of reasons. Basically, it maintained single-handedly Italy as a superpower until the War of Candia, the Siege of Candia. It represents one of the greatest sort of civilizational accomplishments during the Renaissance. This in part happened because it was elected as an honorary Protestant from of course, a Catholic identity, as it essentially escaped some inquisitions, regulations. Venice was a safe haven as far as publishing, printing, especially, in fact, the early modern age was concerned. Venice was, as we just said, a very strong power. We looked at different battles, if anything, that I was satisfied with Molinella and lately Caravaggio. There was actually a lot of medieval Venetian military history, and not only to browse. I guess the reason why we didn't discuss Venice so much is, first and foremost, as always, a random one from the cycle, meaning that Venice didn't pop up in the extractions, right? And so we are at this point. I think we made multiple videos, of course, about the Italian maritime republics, so that of course we refer to Venice quite often. After all, I'm just making here a simple check. Yes, we definitely made, well, not so much actually, even a few. Well, we talk about the medieval Venetian navy organization, medieval Venetian army organization. We talked about the various, we didn't search for Venice here, just Venetian, Venice, just 3 videos en passant, including just one dedicated to medieval Venice between 1300 and 1450, so it's a general introduction. So yeah, definitely we must do much more about Venice. Another reason may be the specificity of the Serenissima, in fact, the pool of the other Italian communes, because as we'll see also today, as we will realize, for example, that the official name of the Venetian commune was in fact the commune of Venice still, is its relative specificity, even against, as I was just saying, backdrop, as we were just saying, of shared similarity with Italian communes. And I will not digress now on how and why Venice was so significantly different. Being a maritime republic alone, as you understand, and especially like in the case of Venice, literally on a lagoon, has very important implications. The fact that Venice, for example, did not belong to the Holy Roman Empire, nor to the Italic Kingdom, because it was technically a piece of the Byzantine Empire, ideally, regardless of her de facto independence and, by this point, complete autonomization from the empire. There is also the fact that it's actually the most powerful of the Italian maritime republics, so that, as we explained, it would lead to sort of greater relevance also historically wise, especially as a maritime power. Even though in the later 15th century, the Venetian condotta was the best army in Europe, together with the Burgundian ordinances as well. So we're looking at a quite interesting subject. Besides, Venice has a very peculiar internal order that today we will analyze in a period that, as you know, is very crucial. Just yesterday I made a video about the mid-14th century crisis. I talked about this unexpectedly often compared to, for being just mostly a social history topic compared to others, but it's really an epoch changing era and generations. It's also very interesting to observe this from the perspective of the Italian communes that fundamentally transitioned to tendentially monarchic regimes. What we'll see today with Marin Faliero is in part, at least an attempt in what will remain a republican system, a senatorial system, definitely an oligarchic one, but still like Venice, in fact. And there is, since the late 13th century, a quite distinct consolidation of the Venetian regime through governmental control that is really unprecedented in any other commune, and that is very well comparable with the one of Genoa, to the detriment of the latter, as a matter of fact. This is especially true in the later period of the War of Chioggia, where the Genoese, that has been provided with the second largest navy in the Mediterranean, in fact, were the only ones capable of taking on the Venetian one and potentially succeeding in taking out Venice entirely, which in that war was feasible. But even after the bloody losses that Venice suffered in that war, although surviving in it, in fact, it recovered much more quickly than her Ligurian counterpart. It was instead run by a much more privatistic system, right? Genoa was run by guilds fundamentally. Also later on, the Bank of St. George, that, as you know, will substitute the Fugga as the main subsidizer, main financer of the Habsburgic Empire, was not so unitarily, was not and cohesively ordained, right? Venice is a true state. It has a massive internal control, political unity, and this process is forged from what was, in fact, historically a conventional commune, however, taking the successful path. That can be explained also through different factors, including, again, this rampant naval power that, in a sense, had to prompt like unity of command to begin with, politically and strategically. What the Italians put at sea, really, especially Venice and Genoa at this point, is utterly insane in the sheer magnitudinal scale of wealth. Had, say, Venice or Genoa done so, but they would have not been so rich either at that point. Just as land powers for land armies, likely, at least the Italic kingdom would have been unified in a way or another much, we can say earlier, because the Italic kingdom was never unified, as a matter of fact. The later Italian kingdom was. But just for saying also, look, that there is an enormous page of military history that was played at sea, mostly by these two powers that de facto controlled most of the intercontinental trade. I made multiple videos on this topic, and that really reflected some of the single-handedly most successful policies in the history of mankind. So these are all reasons worth of enough consideration. Today we'll look at the internal mechanisms of Venice and how, during this crisis, that brings to a further institutionalization, further sort of concretization, especially of oligarchic rule, were declining again in the Venetian case. I should also point out another thing, that is, this video is the first of a branch of the cycle, the Went Distinguished. I don't remember which one it was technically, because I'm so ahead now in video preparations. It was months ago that I prepared this stuff. And that has to do with the Italian signories at large, which is a term that today we're not going to analyze, also because Venice de facto does not become a signory, among the other things, but as you know, is a historiographical convention that we use. The reason being, even for that, we made so much about the Italian communal era, say the golden age of the Italian communes, but very few about the later Italian signories, content of which is actually even very difficult to find in a at least systemic, structured fashion, which is yet likely another reason why, together, for example, with language barrier, etc., like people do not study this stuff. So I'm glad to begin with Venice, which seems quite appropriate given the fact that by this point the lagoon city was actually heading towards an unprecedented level of power also in the terra firma that will not really be consolidated until especially the first half of the 15th century, but that after the war against the Della Scala, when Venice essentially fought against Verona together with the Florentine allies, and had in fact a heavy involvement also in terms of mercenary forces and barbuta, and this is all a topic that I discussed. I made a video about the Visconti and Veneto lordships, right, and the soldiers of fortune. We talked about free companies recently. We'll have to come back on this, especially for Venice at some point. Really seems quite fitting. The triangle that, as you know, would form in more concrete ways would be Milan, Venice, Florence. Mostly Florence and Venice allied against Milan to prevent the latter from literally taking over the entirety of central and northern Italy, which we will also come back on, because equally, not even on Milan or the Papal States, we made too much. Like, I have a series ongoing on Florence, as you know, for the regional historical one, in fact, that is quite interesting, but we really miss a large piece, especially of 15th century Italian signories. And also the 14th century is really crucial and fundamental, and I always have the impression it gets skipped in general, as it is actually a very complicated phase in European history at large, and not only. Of course, Italy has a quite unique circumstantial political landscape. You don't find really, every country is different, but Italy is sort of more different than the others, mostly because of the tendentially regional character of this city-states powers that is unknown really in other countries. Cities do not go very far beyond their walls. Here they literally build states that have militaries as large as one of the largest kingdoms in Europe. And Venice is really an incredibly interesting power. If you're interested, by the way, in her military at this point, before I gave you some titles, I will also post them down below in the related videos, topics, comment, etc. Right, so studying the history of all these cities may be confusing. I have someone just stopping by yesterday saying, I really like your channel, it's great, I learned so much. Only when sometimes you make a video, start a video, the sense is that the topics are so precise that it's difficult to get the references what we're talking about. This is unfortunately something that I predicted happening years ago already, because looking at of course, the younger generations that come on the scene, they interact on the internet, etc. My guess, my take was that they have already been grown without any trace of historical culture. We're basically the last generation that at some point had a fixed, clear, systemic, structured understanding of more or less what happened, when, which countries existed there. Newer generations have no clue about this. I don't think nobody had ever actually made a comment like that, but I'm not surprised. I would say that our videos are fairly well circumstantiated, meaning that, of course, they may go pretty in-depth, historically wise, but I think here, like, what extra information do I have to give you? Like, don't you have a background on Venetian history, also from the other videos that I already made? So let's be honest. Just, if you need that, there is Wikipedia. Then on Schwerpunkt we do something else. Of course, so there are some aspects. Today we'll go fairly in depth on things that most historically interested people have never really heard of. But in general, even when we look at lesser incidents in these, that is, I think, the most interesting aspect of the Middle Ages, in part also as far as the Italian communes, because of this apparent fragmentation, so that you have to understand exactly what's going on. The systems were, the fact that there were so many different city-states had nothing to do with the smaller scale of events. Actually, they were so deeply intertwined, they were particularly homogeneous in kind, and the forces agitating within, as I said before, really are by scale the ones that entire kingdoms have. So not individually but unitarily, with leagues, with alliances, but even with single powers at this point. Think about Milan or in fact the same Venice that mostly operated at sea, however, at this point, or Florence, etc. We'll come back on that topic in particular. So even these apparently lesser incidents, we may talk about this different shades in a city-state, institutional character, etc., actually paved the way for or shaped the larger events, which sometimes are merely the same local happenings that by broadening or heightening their impact take on a broader importance. All right. This is a period, for example, we observed recently in the video about Charles IV of Bohemia. It's really his times. And as you know, there is a strong contact between Prague and the papacy, Rome, Avignon, and this other, with Tuscany, with Milan. So everything actually is contextual to what we have seen many, many times. So starting with Venice, I think, is interesting. So Venetian history in the 14th century reveals multiple distinct facets that, in truth, are tightly interwoven. There is this peculiar framework in Venice's domestic governance, her interactions with the Levant that had historically built up, including Saint Mark, meaning that, the Venetian patron saint, as you know, was translated. His remains were translated from Egypt, from Alexander of Egypt. That was probably the apostolic see of Saint Mark, and one of his resting place back to Venice, where you have the Basilica of Saint Mark. And the Italians were in the Levant before the Crusades, after the Crusades, and especially fighting terribly at sea against one another for the control of those routes connecting with the Silk Road, etc. Venice had the upper hand. Genoa, they were struggling, actually. Exactly at this point, there are tensions that disturb the trade routes that are extremely complicated. We will make countless videos about the political and strategical background, the Venetian-Genoese wars. There again are many. They are immense by the sheer amount. We're talking about millions of florins spent for this campaign. So this is also for other events. I mean, the Venetian siege of Zara in the 40s of the 14th century cost 1 million ducats. That is equivalent fundamentally with the Florentine. Florin is a sort of more universal because of the old Angevin wealth hegemony. So there is all an enormous issue because every power, no power is invincible ever, right? Take that out of your mind. We profitably criticize the concept of geopolitics and all its sort of deterministic and inconsistent implications, both morally and scientifically. There's always a way through, right? The control over the Adriatic, for example, doesn't have to be given for granted by Venice, that not only has, powerful neighbors that threaten her possessions from mainland, other Italian seigniories, the Kingdom of Hungary, but the same Genoa that can't simply circumnavigate the peninsula and threaten the same Serenissima. At this time, it's fundamentally Hungary knocking at the door. There is all the issue with Zara that is taken, retaken, and all this stuff. We will talk about those campaigns too, because are very, very interesting. Together with a bit more of Croatian history that we have to insert here after becoming controlled by the Hungarian crown. There is also the Venetian engagement in the wider Italian political arena. There is a huge deal, one that had already triggered the sporadic but increasingly consistent Venetian intervention in a terra firma that is normally not a maritime republican interest, right? Especially if you're Venice, right? Pisa has a wide district, wide countryside opening in the Tuscan hinterland. Venice decides that they have just to take ports. That's how, for example, they have done notoriously during the Fourth Crusade. That they don't want any piece of land unless it's basically just so coastal that you can do it, like with Crete, for example. But we will look at that stuff. You understand how big it is as a whole. You can't squeeze everything into a single video. Today, again, we look mostly at the former aspect, the internal, domestic, political framework. Right, the internal organization of the commune. So within Venice's domestic sphere, following the serrata, that is the lock, the closure of the Great Council of 1297, incredibly important event in medieval history. I also made a video about this. This is the oligarchization of the of in this case the Venetian commune, that again is similar to others. It's the lock of the main sort of senatorial posts, and so the crystallization of the Venetian institutional system that would, however, work incredibly well, again, and so reflecting already the incredible public, republican, strategic development of this maritime commune. An event, by the way, that finalized a political transformation already ongoing for 100 years by that point. Venice had risen pretty fast historically, right? It was a novel city, right? It had really emerged from the lagoons in the High Middle Ages. And we'll get to that point because the Venetians are characterized by a shocking aggressiveness, right? The Venetian power expands with a viral sort of metastatic capacity to invade everything, to destroy any competitor. They really know their deal at sea, and they're really a might to behold on the waves. And so after the serrata of the Great Council, there were no more sudden shifts. That was the point. This is what defines Venetian history at large. The system does witness to gradual adjustments and refinements, as it would have been unavoidable in an ancien regime government and the institutional body, etc., but fundamentally remains the same. This ensured essentially those specific Venetian senatorial families that were already controlling the main naval assets and, of course, the overseas possession, etc., to remain in charge and to keep administrating that pretty well in tandem also with the various estates that depended on them. So it was an incredibly clever, refined system. We will not discuss this today. We'll, however, see it surely at some point on its own because, again, it's one of the most important pages in medieval European history. Now, these changes entailed phasing out or diminishing outdated institutions at most, right? Establishing new magistracies or dividing existing ones. Basically the same. It was just a form of repetition, depending also on how these families developed and more. So yet consistently adhering to an organic evolution free of violence or sudden disruptions. This is also crucial because, as you know, Italian history is actually pretty violent. The communal one is probably the single most bellicose in the entire continent, meaning that, as we said before, in Venice, it's a good example of this, of the sheer amount of resources invested for war has been observed by scholars like Contamine and more, to be really out of scale compared to any other country that we know of during the Middle Ages. So it's utterly insane. And in most mainland communes, this translated to some continuous perpetual form of not much necessarily instability, but of expansion, first of all, of the bigger communes like Milan or Florence over the smaller ones, so creating the regional states. And in the meanwhile, so in theory, the constant destabilization of these other communes, the infiltration of bigger powers, this constant sort of game of balance that the Italians will try to maintain until, in fact, the Renaissance, where they realized that basically by not allowing for one of these major powers to take over, the peninsula had remained fundamentally exposed to bigger monarchies that, if anything, at that point exploited the rivalry between the Italian states. Say that if Genoa or Venice had united their fleet, it would have been strategically, logistically impossible for anyone to invade Italy. But of course they didn't care, because Venice and Genoa pursued different goals. They had different interests in the time. It's like saying those people why didn't the Celts unite against Rome? Could they? Why would they? Right? You must provide with an historical explanation for that. What ifs are probably the dumbest thing ever if they are, look at this level of incredibly superficial and fantasy, like made up alternative impossibility, because history is much more interesting in the way it happened, not in what it could have been, as a matter of fact. And so the fact that the lock of the Greater Council had sort of crystallized the oligarchs in charge and preventing, of course, Venice to become a signory, so ruled essentially by one single figure, really provided with enough power individually, like in other governments, like the Milanese one, for example, brings also to a big deal of pacification. Of course, again, Venice was surrounded by water. It was more complicated to try to destabilize it. Who could besiege it? Again, just Genoa could, and they failed at it. So Venice was virtually immune from most also the external interference, as we understand it, for other continental powers. Now, the Serrata itself unfolded fully across a single generation, steadily bearing the so-called new men. So those people who could have become part of the Greater Council. And whose admission had still been conceivable in 1297. In fact, up to that point. For families, this happened really, also in the broader European nobility, right? Before, like in the 11th, 12th century, a knight could be anyone in a sense. Nobility was rather de facto than de jure. I made multiple videos on this. From the late 12th and the 13th century, you have just essentially a major split between the higher and the lower nobility that further widens during, in fact, these moments of crisis in the mid-14th century, and that is essentially foundational to the Ancien regime as we understand it for centuries and centuries in European history. Venice had this particular way to it. For families already included, access to the Great Council transitioned from being elective to hereditary, right? You pass from offices that are, like in the other Italian communes, normally shared, alternated. This is actually still the case, but now there is essentially, if you're part of these families, you have an hereditary right to be within this system, unlike others, right? And so you could change posts, but fundamentally you were part of the establishment, and that's it. As a result, membership in the Greater Council became, at age 25, an inherent right for individuals from these families, with only their early entry at 20 requiring a vote, which evidently was still sort of arbitrary. In 1303, that's the date in which it was established. So we see a few years later from the lock. This made it imperative to report births and marriages, by the way, to the avogaria. That it stems from the advocati, right? So the lawyers. This was a judicial authority. This is very, very important because it basically prevents unauthorized entries, and it shows how private the system of a thriving maritime republic had been up to this point. Here we should give the background to this family. It's very complicated, but even though Venice had a very unitary government, even before the lock, the adventurism of different families had stemmed, first of all, from the fact that they were freemen. And so they had made their fortune during the generations just out of their force, right? These were essentially military families. They had invested heavily in their naval power possessions overseas that couldn't be fully as directly controlled properly by the Venetian government. In a sense, they were the Venetian government themselves. This is the beauty also that allows, for example, these maritime republics to be the only actual permanent naval power in the Middle Ages. Also conferring Venice like the first, really from these times onwards, really the first case in military history of distinct separation between the navy and the army, which really shows that kind of rigor and rigidity that is typical of Venetian order, but also the fluidity and the far reach of their political vision. And so by registering these families, you're basically saying you're tied to Venice. You can't be just a guy that, I don't know, has some landed estates in Crete, goes back and forth there from their houses in Venice to other places in Greece and beyond, and they just care about their business without participating to the government, and so creating some kind of separation of interest, etc. No, now in order to be part of the Greater Council, you must really be officially part of a system. You have to be transparent. You have to tell who you are, who your clan is, what kind of possessions you have. You're going to be scrutinized in every kind of action. That, of course, is still relatively autonomous out there because, again, this is not a contemporary state. The Great Council does not have a full control on everything. Absolutely not. But in fact, the advantage, the privilege, the prerogative coming from being part of this system also strengthened the system itself in turn because it was much more transparent, clear, well, better regulated, etc. These records where you would be registered were documented in a ledger that 2 centuries later from these events, in fact 1506, evolved into the Golden Book of the Patriciate, right? These were the Venetian senators. I made recently a video about the traditional meaning of the Patriciate that would be extremely interesting to analyze in the Venetian case with all those admirals and, in fact, famed commanders. As a consequence, the Great Council, which saw its numbers grow continuously, reaching over 2,000 by the 16th century. So it's a pretty big system. It's very inclusive, oligarchic-wise, right? And this tells you how widely distributed wealth was in Venice, just like in the Italian communes. Remember that Italy maintained continuously, without any fracture, even in the Dark Ages, the highest per capita wealth in the world from the Roman Empire to the late 17th century, when exactly Venice basically bled the Ottomans white, the siege of Candia, but also by bleeding herself white in the same process, and so being surpassed by the English and the Dutch, but still remaining pretty rich, by the way. And the Great Council, in this sense, came to resemble the harangue of the nobility, which was yet another council. You know how the Italian communes work. It was a series, just like the other communes of councils, except it was, and that's why we call them city-states other than towns or anything. This is a specific Italian characteristic. There is an overarching power that is represented above them, right? So they're not separated guilds that do whatever they want. There is a truly central system that organizes wealth is incredibly more effective and efficient. It's just, reflecting the broader resources that were invested in this for a shared political goal. And the Great Council thus supplanted with its log the popular arenga as well, right? Which was gradually marginalized, even as a formality, until a law on April the 7th, 1423, decreeing that the Great Council's decisions were valid as though endorsed by the arenga. So, in other words, they bypass the commoner's power, because, let's be honest, at this point, it's the elites that really rule everywhere in the world, especially after the Black Death. Here, it's not there yet, but again, Venice has other sort of a much less dispersively compacting internal compacting dynamic than other communes, as we said before. So this process begins earlier, and in the same ceremonial introduction of the Doge to the populace, the Doge is not that Doge, by the way. It's obviously deriving from dux, which was one of the historical terms, like in late antiquity, that existed in fact, what was the duchy of Venice, and that was a Byzantine legacy. Hence, the Doge was essentially the head of state, but one, as we'll understand now, that could not simply take over as a monarch, as a signor, right? Like in other Italian city-states, or most other Italian city-states. Virtually everyone, even in Florence, even though it was masked by the Medici, under a republican vest, right? And so in the same ceremonial introduction of the Doge to the populace, the concluding phrase after these reforms, there was, quote, "if it pleases you, the people," right? Which harked back to the old popular consent of the freemen in arms from the Romano-Germanic tradition, was omitted, meaning that essentially now the Great Council ruled, as it was, in a sense, in fact, the voice of the people. Of course, it represented a decisive moral majority of the community, and even formally, institutionally, this necessity of we need the popular acclamation is now like we decided because we are Venice, basically. And this is again incredible for a system that would stay so republican and so republicanly effective. The aristocratic framework, which assumed its nearly final shape in these opening decades of the 14th century, was not the product of a single moment or the abrupt maneuver of a handful of overbearing families. This was driven by necessity, a bit the generalized crisis of the era, the increasingly military commitment of Venice abroad, so to say, even just maybe a few tens of kilometers inland, but still abroad in their mentality. The serrata and the measures that followed gave formal structure to a condition that had been gradually molded by different demands, socioeconomical, for example, and political developments. There is a mutual reliance between the city's geographic and economic circumstances that are sort of the most readily apparent, but not the most necessarily the most important. And in fact, its social and political system that was quite unique already by this point, and that is in fact the most important. Now, the scarcity of resources on the islets of Venice, particularly after the Lombard-era migrations, to which it said that Venice dates back to in terms of the refugees that left the mainland, taking refuge in the lagoons, necessitated trade with far-off lands, especially Constantinople. In this era, this is fully developed as an activity, and so you know what the story was in the past. Following Ravenna's decline, Ravenna was the seat of the Byzantine Exarchate, so in theory, the Duchy of Venice responded broadly. This was the closest, sort of strongest center of Byzantine power. So the trade in with the Levant increased, right? The For example, Comacchio was the first, most important century in the roughly the same area. It was on the right bank of the Po River. Venice is, of the delta. Venice on the left side was taken out brutally by Venice, mostly for controlling salt mines, which is also the reason why Venice had gone at war recently against the La Scala, for example. So you understand the reasons behind this. This also shows you, by the way, as other peoples, it really emerged out of nothing. We described this for Switzerland. Switzerland had literally nothing. There's nothing in Switzerland. There aren't any particular resources whatsoever, right? So that yet another story, geopolitics, but geopolitics, my eyes, all right? It's all about moral force, right? And will, right? Will to power, especially. And this is also very well showed by the Venetian navy. Stinky, humid, salty, stilt houses. Instead, they built one of the single greatest marvels in the history of mankind, right? And they did this through war, by the way, which you may want to take note of how a civilization worth of this name is made. Yet such expansive commerce, of course, demanded significant resources in turn, and yielding substantial profits fostered the emergence of affluent families. Also because of the aforementioned strategic needs of unity of command, right, of leadership, of general organization, discipline, and so on. Owing to the source of nature of their riches, these families supported many dependents who relied on their patrons' commercial endeavors and triumphs. Furthermore, this wealth originated beyond Venice, evading the oversight that wealth from land and property encountered in mainland cities. Right? That's yet another great advantage. You have actually a very few land to control territorially. Again, just like after the Fourth Crusade, the French, the Crusaders, offer Venice for her services what was in their habit, like the quota of land, right, of inland, right, in the Balkans. Venice says, no, we don't want that. We want just the ports. Because really, you entrench in a citadel that you can resupply from the sea, where you are the only naval power worth of this name. That's impregnable, virtually impregnable. You make a lot of money without all the expenses to control vast expanses of interland that are mostly populated by someone you have to keep down, to invest more resources, to render obedient and more. So Venice skips completely this aspect and makes a shockingly traumatic amount of wealth just in this way. And fighting a lot at sea as well. So it's not like they escaped other forms of fight and cost, etc. But still, in a way that seemed way more convenient than fighting on land. Ask the Latin Empire, by the way. So this distinctive situation endowed Venice's wealthy families with a tangible independence, bolstered by a sense of pride and self-assurance forged through living overseas amid myriad perils, depending almost entirely on their own resources. This is also really the mindset of maritime republics, fierce independence, and just this habitual projection across the horizon that makes you just a better leader, a better commander, better, more refined, right? It's just another way of seeing the world, really, and it's very, very difficult to understand this probably from a Venetian perspective that was so unique in kind. As we explained, Venice was the most maritime of the maritime republics, and also the most powerful. So imagine those characteristics elevated to the greatest power. This had been a bit the issue of it all. Paradoxically, like the independence of these families would bring to the recognition from their experience that a more unitary government was needed. And it's not like some families did not fight back. it's unsurprising that as trade surged after the year 1000, certain leading families set themselves apart from the common people, which was also, again, a normal behavior. If you're better in tradition, you're better. There's nothing to do about that. If you're more successful, it's because of God's grace. Works do matter, regardless of what someone dared to say. And the affirmation of these families is actually backed by a host of popular supporters. So, classistic interpretation of history thrown to the bin immediately. I don't understand how mentally feeble a person can be to literally buy, historical materialism or this other, Marxistic BS. Now, these leading families initially aimed to block the dogeship from becoming hereditary, because they understood that if a monarch had emerged, even if a sole leader was required, they would have, of course, lost their autonomy. In the Italian communes, there were, as we've seen, notably the consuls. There were two, just like in ancient Rome, that you had the podestat. It was a tendentially more monarchic figure, but they were all elective, right? Venice required just early on one leader, because that's how they had been habituated from also the Byzantine government. That was, as you know, very centralistic in mindset. But they elected, which was also, in fact, basically an ancient tradition. Anyway, the Byzantines didn't have hereditary posts, nor historically before. But these lands were not really feudalized. But Venice was, of course, very much influenced, was within, essentially, the Romano-Germanic sphere, not much the Greco-Byzantine one, after all. But the in fact, avoiding any hereditary development towards a more feudal monarchic direction was also a wise choice. And then the same families worked to curb the dogeship's powers by separating many of its duties, overseeing its actions via the councillors, and currently to forestall popular unrest and changes, because that's how the system had become. Again, the monarchic threat had been curbed early on. Now, the greater problem seemed the people, right? The commoners that, as we've seen, are gradually ousted from the institutional system. And this is what's happening also in other cities in Italy. We've seen Florence, for example, having problems in the 40s with the popular government basically resurges over the guilds, men, the priori. There is bit of, again, this moment of rebellion across the world, you can say, the jacquerie, the revolts of the salaried workers in many, especially many European cities. In Venice, there is something similar, because of course the people were all active part of this. They were quite entrepreneurial, minded. They were active in the say in trade and in the craft and so on. So you had to be careful about what was going on, especially considering that, as we will see now, and like it's the case of Marin Faliero, that is a Doge, in fact, the monarch tendentially associates with the people, right? And normally it's the nobility, the oligarchs, that prevent that bond to choke them in turn. So this family sought to secure for themselves the authority they already wielded in practice by full institutional sanction. This was all a natural outcome of Venice's singular economic existence, in many ways too, not a premeditated scheme. The people could be better off under this very powerful patrons, because they would have been better off than most people in the world at the time, and under them. And the needs of trade compelled the merchants to steer foreign policy with growing assurance and to maintain internal peace and administrative stability. You want to take that into account. There must be a state that protects you while you're crossing the Mediterranean. You need, again, especially a military organization to back that up. you need also society to be stable. There is no economical prosperity when war is happening at any level. At least these merchants will fund the same wars of the Republic, for the Republic, but it's obviously an ever more self-defensive and of course, stabilizing necessity that is readily self-evident. The new system, or more precisely the social and political distinctions it introduced, successfully navigated various crises sparked by external setbacks blamed on the ineptitude of the families dominating power. You could scapegoat this or that doge for having been ineffective. Of course, there was a lot of senatorial, patrician, political rivalry, competition. That's also very complicated because they had assets scattered a bit all across the Mediterranean that did play a role, just like in other Italian communes, like whichever side of the countryside it would expand on directionally would have an impact on the people that mostly from that side of the city owned the land in the district. Now, this system worked for Venice, right? This resilience stemmed from the ever-increasing economic prosperity nurtured by the internal regime's consistency, which acted as the genuine glue uniting the city's estates and easing resistance to the aristocracy's ascent towards a more monarchic place. When the War of Chioggia, where in the second half of the 14th century, again, we will see it in another video, but it's very famous, more or less we know what we're talking about, concluded without domestic fallout and with only the inclusion of the 30 most meritorious popular families into the Great Council at that point, because that was, again, still a space, right, for this inclusion, but it was not any more systemic, right? The aristocratic system surmounted its most formidable challenge. They made it to accept that they were the ones who would choose that arrangement. That had been the moment of greatest crisis of Venice. The commune risked to be taken out by the Genoese, literally. And even then, charges of incompetence and cliquishness among the patricians persisted, yet the recognition of shared interests, crucial in that dire moment, the metus hostilis makes also internal enemies friends, without which the well-being enjoyed by all estates would have collapsed, prevailed. This is a great lesson in politics and in war from Venice. Also in the other Italian communes, in moments of great crisis, you would recall all the exiles. That's normally how it worked, because, of course, these were very, specific communities. You would have essentially them, city is a city, right? You live in that. These were metropolises for world standards at the time, but it's still a very circumscribed space. So it's not just like being a lord that has vast estates somewhere in an area at a broader regional level. This is still about the city after all. Without that city, what would have those landed owners in Venice, but some pirates or maybe modest lords by the time being scattered in the Mediterranean, but without protection, without a glue, right? Separated and thus exposed. The Commune of Venice, as I stressed, it continued to be known as until 1462. Everybody says the Serenissima because there's all a tradition in modern history, but this was technically still just like the Commune of Venice, right? And so something that was very Italian, actually, in mentality. So showing how the Byzantine legacy is not even just the only thing you have to remember, because we remember that, and the Republic's most serene Republic of Venice. There was an Italian Commune of Venice, right? That's how they saw themselves. Operated under 4 councils. So the major or great council that we've seen, and those of the Signoria. That is the Pregadi, or the Senate properly meant, and the 10 This was normal for communal standards. There were these different councils interacting with one another, each supervising different aspects. Now, the major Great Council, as we know, held true sovereignty. But as its membership swelled, its authority grew vaguer, in a sense, because you could have so many people, and it was not so easy to discipline them all. Right? So it was harder to wield the entire Senate. Just imagine these assemblies, by the way. It would be very interesting to attend them. Of course, there were less people than those represented in a sense, but in a physical sense. But they still were represented in it. And it would limit its role to ratifying laws pre-drafted by the Signoria and Senate and selecting various magistracies. That's kind of obvious. There is more administrative work for lesser aspects that have to converge to eventually bring the major council to make the big decision, the official decision. So even so, this selection process, much like the dogeship itself, often involved several stages. The executive arm was the Signoria, comprising the Doge and his 6 councillors, refreshed yearly. So you see how this cyclicity was actually maintained, even within the same families. The posts were shared. That's how, think even as a sort of teamwork, and how being part of all this, it's like, I don't know, in the Roman Senate. You knew that you had to pass through those stages. It was expected from everyone, right? And so everybody knew what the other had gone through. They could sort of self-identify better, to rule better, to govern better, to administer better. Alongside, you had the 3 heads of the Quarantia as junior councillors. Quarantia, not Quaranta, by the way. The Doge became more of a figurehead in all this, and an emblem of the state, the representative of the state, but not a monarch, not a guy that could impose himself over this system just per se. Of course, he was very important, but that's not what his power was founded on. On the contrary, it was just conferred by these councils. And each election's ducal oath, so the oath that the Doge had to swear to defend the Republic, etc., further diminished his authority after all. Remember what they had done with the people. They had just said, if you like that, crossed out. But here, of course, the Doge has to receive that blessing of the Senate. In the year 1400, here we're talking institutions, so we can jump briefly, like from time to time, to explain better how this system evolved. Then we will get to Marin Faliero's revolt. To dispel any confusion, the correctors stripped the Doge of the title Lord, substituting it with Messer, which means Mr. Right? This is incredibly important because, again, there was a hint to lordship that was eliminated even in the official vocabulary, so that Messer played much more finely. A simple expression of respect, right? Mr. Right? It was important because this was tribe. It means master at the end of the day, right? Magister in Latin, so that's the point. But it's still referred to a freeman, basically, and so that level of basic nobility that freemen have, and so that this system fundamentally represented in practice as, again, patricians, so true freemen, right? Remember that the Italian communes had maintained the strongest originality in the Romano-Germanic meaning of nobility. That is not, of the freeman, that is not, again, a commoner. Like most people think, I'm a freeman because I'm a guy out there in some fantasy world where I live alone, I provide everything. But that did not exist in the Middle Age. Most people were somebody, even namely freemen, were somebody else's people. These were real freemen, right? They were real freemen as real noblemen in their own regard. Even if, say, from most elite European royalty perspective, this would have seemed like commoners, but they actually weren't. They were so powerful that they actually equated to nobility, also officialized in other systems. Because, by the way, this was shared, right? They didn't think like they were separated from the world, from other polities. We think too much in sort of paradox game sense. Here, like every color corresponds to a different state that is different. That's not how reality works, all right? Only rare personalities, by the way, could exert personal sway over the state's course in any sort of greater sense. Of course, there were very powerful, respected individuals that had a great influence on politics, but Venice at large knew how to still frame it within her admirable constitution. Gradually, over the 14th century, a more comprehensive entity was taking shape, the collegium, made up of the signoria plus the 16 savi, whose roots trace back to, in fact, the century, the 14th, as temporary commissions chosen by the Senate that slowly solidified into permanence, really typical of the era. During this time, it was within the Senate that a thoughtful wisdom grounded in experience and tradition merged steadfastness of principles with caution and confidentiality, vital components for triumph both on the seas and in foreign affairs. During this century, the Senate embodies a thoughtful wisdom derived from experience and tradition coupled with confidentiality. Casanova Dolce, to think about all the spying system of Venice. So, of course, it wasn't necessarily more here at this time than it would become, but in the sense that, again, in this elegant setting, various houses of the various cas in the lagoon city, well protected by the waves and the navy, the Senate that shared this vast fortune and political power could and would just keep it a bit for themselves. It's that sort of kind of discretion that you really need in politics to be effective. Indeed, key factors, in particular for an effective foreign policy. Other Italian and European powers were a colander in terms of information retention. There were spies everywhere. Just think about it. You have to get into Venice across water. You can simply sneak in, right? It's very heavily surveilled. It's very, very security-based, like it is a general mindset. People know each other. They speak also their own language, by the way. So such qualities are typically absent in communal governments, as we've seen them, in fact, in many other circumstances. And even in lordly regimes that in this period are gradually affirming themselves, where unity and consistency may exist. Look at the Milanese, what kind of monarchic power that they de facto wielded. Prudence and expertise often fall short, however, due to the unrestrained influence of favored individuals. It's really a matter of how you handle territories. It's a completely different logic, all right? Venice is molded truly on those stilt houses in so many ways. The Senate still called the pregati, so those that were sort of prayed to show up in virtue of their own, again, nobiliar freedom, right? Or, quote, experts, in fact, called upon occasionally, because that was the point, has now become fixed, a fixed assembly of 60 members. By 1363, the Senate was joined by a temporary zonta, which means junta, from the same Italian, which the word in English derives, which means from to join, but really to join, also the junctus in Latin, which quickly turned into a near permanent addition, initially comprising 20 members, then expanding to 40, and eventually reaching 60 by the mid-15th century. The Signoria in the mid-14th century instead already collaborates and deliberates alongside it, as do the Quarantia, the Council of Ten, and various specialized offices. Yet this body also risks overexpansion, diluting its original purpose to the point where the most pressing and discrete decisions must be entrusted to a smaller entity, which by the 15th century evolves into the Collegio. By then the Senate's membership nears 300. There are also many other posts, etc., but these were more administrative ones, and again, they were not covered by the nobility. So, of course, the system worked in the typically traditional corporative fashion that we'll also look at better, different estates and so on. Now, emerging almost concurrently with the aristocratic system is a novel institution. That is the Council of Ten, formed following the Tiepolo conspiracy to oversee and adjudicate state matters, thus bypassing the traditional judicial body of the Quarantia. The Tiepolo conspiracy, by the way, is quite interesting. For the record, the plot emerged during a period of political tension just following the Serrata in 1297, which restricted, as we've seen, membership in the Great Council and thus political power to a close group of elite families. This alienated some older noble families, including the Tiepolos and Querinis, who felt marginalized. External pressures like Venice's war with Ferrara, we will talk about that, it's a very interesting clash, and there was literally a crusade waged against Venice on that occasion. In fact, papal interference was yet another issue. Third, fueled discontent. It's remarkable that these attempted regime changes always were in parallel some military defeats of some sort. And so on June 15th, 1310, the conspirators planned a two-pronged attack on the Doge's palace to kill the Doge Pietro Gradenigo and seize control. Tiepolo led one group through the streets while Querini approached from another direction. However, the plot was betrayed, allegedly by a conspirator who warned the government, and faltered due to poor coordination and a storm that had hampered their movements. Government forces rallied by Gradenigo repelled the attack. Querini was killed in the fighting, and Tiepolo fled after his supporters dispersed. Speaking of the aforementioned Council of the Ten, initially an extraordinary commission, it remained provisional until 1335. However, its role in political surveillance allowed it to gradually emerge as a pervasive and commanding presence across all facets of state affairs, particularly from the 15th to the 16th centuries, until it was realigned with its initial scope by the end of that period. Its judicial duties were fortified with rigorous protections in grave cases like those of Faliero, and later we will see now, and later the Carmagnola. That's also very famous. When the Signoria and a Zonta were included, eliminating any hint of capriciousness, established to shield the aristocratic order from popular uprisings, the council proved equally or perhaps more effective in policing the aristocracy itself, thwarting its slide into an oligarchy dominated by a handful of richer, more influential families. Its success in largely averting this decline stands as a more concrete achievement of the Ten than the ominous reputation bestowed upon it by tales and fiction. So the gradual formation and evolution of Venice's constitution along with this new aristocratic path remained largely unaffected over time by the Marin Faliero incident that we will see now. His actions arose not so much from a true popular revolt against the aristocracy, but rather from a dissatisfaction with the setbacks and losses of the Third War with Genoa, 1350-1355, so yet again a military defeat. We will see it now at Moton in Greece, ignited by the fiery and haughty temperament of this Doge, Marin Faliero. So concerning this conspiracy, which was quashed just before it could erupt, yet again, as we've seen with the Tiepolo and Querini's one, we possess many specifics, though its trigger and the Doge's ultimate aim remain murky. Right? Chronicles would be relatively detailed, about the event, but they wouldn't quite ask him, also because he was decapitated eventually. And so it wasn't even that important. I mean, we could wonder today if we dramatize the story, but at the end of the day, it was really normal for these coups to be carried out, at least to be attempted in all the Italian political landscape, especially at this point, because the systems were becoming more robust. And so it was believed that even a coup, even just from a strictly tactical point of view, was sort of way more, could be way more effective in a time of crisis when people are also a bit more passive to eventually rise and to maintain power effectively. By the way, it's not like at the time it was not known why Marin Faliero behaved the way he did. In fact, there was a dedicated volume preserving the trial proceedings, unfortunately gone lost. That is, again, a measure of how frustratingly undocumented we are on matters that, of course, at the time were taken very seriously, in a judicial, administrative sense. Now, Faliero was around 70 years old, by the way, when he embarked on this ill-fated endeavor. So, surely someone who knew how the system worked. He had devoted his life to serving the commune of Venice with distinction in numerous key military and civic positions. These were all proud Venetians, all right? They weren't seeing it as a, okay, we're less Venetians if this regime change succeeds, all right? Faliero had acted as an envoy to the same King of Hungary and also to Charles IV. We were mentioning him before. The Luxembourg court in Prague had quite strong Italian connections. Think about Petrarch, imperial and papal dignitary at the same time, or Cola di Rienzi, that was also taken prisoner by Charles, but basically Romanized, like schooling in the classics, the entire Bohemian court. So being well treated after all. We'll come also on those topics. We never really made a video about Avignon, like a fully fledged sort of Avignonese papacy period video. You see how I made like 2,300 videos and based on medieval history. These things happen. They can't happen, right? But they are indeed worth mentioning, even just in this way, at every opportunity. So when elected as Doge, by the way, the same Marin Faliero was in Avignon, right, discussing the same war with Genoa with either the Pope or the King of Aragon, by the way. So this is the level of literal royalty, which, of course, the Venetian Doge were ruling, Faliero being a figure of all respect. Hence, it was fitting even that after Doge Andrea Dandolo's death on September 7th, 1354, focus would shift to Faliero as he swiftly garnered 35 of the 41 votes from the electors chosen by the Great Council. That's how they operated, for example. They would simply say, okay, let's make just somebody decide because we are the ones who really rule and know how that is likely to be. But yet we leave this discretional power to other noblemen, of course. Yet prior to Faliero's election, the 5 savvy correctors of the ducal oath had imposed notable restrictions on the Doge's authority over foreign matters. Arriving in Venice on October the 5th of the same 1354, consider this speed, right? The Doge dies in September. In less than a month, the newly elected guy is from Avignon to Venice. All right, it's really impressive. This tells you also how old the story, as people did not travel in the Middle Ages, nobody knew what happened. These are the actual examples that disprove that. Of course, the average peasant wouldn't even have to care about these things, but who had to, of course, would evidently move. And so he arrives in October in Venice, and he installs himself, after taking the ducal oath, as usual, on the external palace staircase landing that would later seal his fate. Faliero had to promptly tackle the fallout from the Sapienza defeat. This, again, is the aforementioned defeat in Greece, which shifted the military landscape and laid the groundwork for peace with Genoa. What had happened? Well, basically in this engagement, which occurred around February the 4th of the same 1354, a Genoese fleet under the command of Paganino Doria decisively defeated the Venetian navy led by Niccolò Pisani. The Venetian fleet consisted of about 35 galleys, while the Genoese had a similar or slightly larger number. Despite Venice's reputation as a formidable naval power, Pisani's forces were caught off guard and outmaneuvered. The Genoese exploited favorable conditions and possibly Venetian overconfidence or poor coordination, resulting in a crushing victory. The outcome was devastating for Venice. Most of their galleys were captured or destroyed, and thousands of Venetian sailors and soldiers were taken prisoner, including Pisani himself, though he was later released. If you want a figure of the importance of these losses in the video about Venetian Navy organization, you'll find plenty of numbers of how Venice was increasing the number of properly sort of public galleys at the disposal, in fact, of the government that had historically just passed from private means. And so again, I explain all this in that video. Estimates suggest Venice lost at Sapienza around 20-25 galleys and suffered significant casualties. This defeat weakened Venice's position in the ongoing war and allowed Genoa to gain temporary supremacy in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Right. By the way, it's quite interesting that Faliero was talking with the King of Aragon because, as you know, the Venetians in the Aragonese will finally manage to oust the Genoese from at least the most important and especially the ones that competed against Venice theaters by obliging them to open the Atlantic route and to reach the channel, basically. From there, this opened a bit to the age of exploration. This also happened because the 100 Years' War was raging. Here we're just a couple of less than 2 years away from the Battle of Poitiers that I made a wide video on, and basically the southern France was severed from the north. So basically all the trade routes from the Champagne fairs that had already been declining to the Rhone Valley, and so the Ligurian Sea were destroyed. So Genoa suffered of that. But as you understand here, they could still be pretty offensive because this is not like a Victorian setting where if you have the strongest fleet, you can simply control an entire swathe of sea and nobody can pass. Here, even if Venice will essentially remain hegemonic in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Genoese will continue operating weaker, risking more, etc. But still, think about the Genoese possessions in the Black Sea. I made a video about Italians, Ottomans, and Tartars in the 15th century for our Eurasian steppes of warfare. That tells you a bit what this was all about. So Genoese history is very interesting. We must make way more videos about Genoa as well. So after this Venetian defeat, by the time peace was secured, Faliero was no more. So what did happen? You wonder how I ended up in this, you see his head rolling. Well, indeed, his dramatic demise may have hastened Venice's readiness to conclude the same peace. Tradition ties Faliero's conspiracy to offensive writings targeting the Doge and Dogaressa, so the wife of the Doge, crafted by young patricians who escaped the punishment. Faliero sought a bit of a novelistic explanation, telling the truth. This is also the time in history where lots of sort of novels in the form of fairy tales, pseudo-factuality emerges. A process of crisis. When crisis breaks out, people start abstracting from reality paradox. And this factual nugget fueled a far grander legend depicting the Dogaressa as a wayward figure, driving the Doge to align with, quote, the admiral of the arsenal. This is really a fully fledged invention. There is nothing true about it. In fact, the Dogaressa, that was at the time a woman of 45, and ostensibly the incidental spark of the plot, lived freely and calmly in Venice until her death. So none of that is irreliable. Furthermore, the Signoria permitted Faliero to allocate a sizable share of his seized assets solely to his wife. The so-called admiral was in fact just a humble shipmaster, for real. Like, we know his name, Bertuccio Isarello, who was indeed executed by hanging, by the way. So he was part of this ducal, if you prefer, repression. Hinting, as we'll see now, at the fact that there were grievances from a certain strata of the populace, which would actually prove that there was a grievance from the lower strata of the population, because this was just like a lower figure, again, a simple shipmaster, that, however, would have represented a popular support towards a ducal monarchy of some sort. And so the reason why, of course, he was later sentenced to death was that the Senate, after Faliero's attempted coup, repressed all those who had supported him, proving again this pseudo-monarchic tendency supported by the populace that is a bit also too much as a reading of Faliero's plot, but it still has something to do with it, also to echo in the Legion this way. Now, setting aside or downplaying personal resentment, the Doge's true motive, as we said before, remains elusive, likely rooted in his outrage over the curbs placed on his power during his absence, via amendments to the ducal oath. It seems plausible that he aspired to become a lord of some sort, a lord of Venice, a sort of monarch, claiming the dominion of mainland rulers by dismantling the aristocracy and leaning on the populace, especially sailors and shipmasters, daring and disgruntled branch. Maybe this is also a too far-fetched interpretation. In any case, the frustration of the latter element in the populace may have stemmed from the exclusion from the councils that we just exposed. It more likely arose from the war's dismal trajectory, as we understand. Again, there is this defeat, there is an attempted coup. This is really typical, not just in communal Italy, by the way. It's also, look at what was happening in France. Again, it's there are always very interesting upheavals after military defeats. And so the aristocratic leadership that was reluctant to secure a favorable peace after early wins had sort of undermined the course of the war by selecting incompetent noble commanders. And so this seemed like so outrageous. It was a matter of honor for same citizenry. So a compounded set of causes. Such criticisms may, however, even be unjust, but in the midst of a luckless war, people seek not truth but culprits to bear the brunt of their discontent, and just seeking any opportunity to seize power, reorganize it in some way. And the scheme was thus crafted on the night of April the 15th, 1355. The conspirators would assemble armed around St. Mark's Square and the Ducal Palace, so the very center of power. The Doge would ring the alarm bell to draw the nobles to the palace, claiming a Genoese fleet loomed at the port. As nobles arrived, they would be slain individually. Then the conspirators would storm through the city yelling, "Long live the people," looting the homes of the fallen and wiping out their offspring. This is the story. Then we do not know because the acts were lost, unfortunately, but this is how the story goes. So definitely there is the element of the disgruntled popular element that was ousted by the senatorial establishment, the Doge having been manipulated politically and limited in his ambitions, the war going bad. So you have the backdrop of this plausible Genoese attack, the knight official power involved here. That's also what makes you think that say a doge may have not been, as we've seen, a monarch, but still someone who attempts such coup at the detriment of an entire establishment. By the way, it's a pretty complicated thing. We can't fully read into it. And so, had this plot succeeded, the doge would be declared lord, and with the noble establishment physically eradicated, the populace would be summoned to govern. Now, it is true that in the Italian communes, razing to the ground the houses of the exiled or the killed was a thing, but eradicating an entire noble system, especially also in a city like Venice that was not that different from other communes as far as fortified house, towers, warehouses, etc. Like it must be really just either you're extremely lucky or everything goes to perfection in a way or another, but otherwise it's difficult to understand whether the ultimate goal was a full takeover. It's possible, though, and as for these designs of such a ghastly slaughter, it's reasonable to suspect later retellings amplified them somewhat, but the direction, if anything, is what we appreciate. The plot's unraveling appears to have stemmed from one conspirator, rattled by a last-minute delay mere hours before action, hinting to a patrician that something was afoot that night without naming the doge, whose role was known only to a select few leaders. So these elements that snap tell you by themselves how actually solid the government was, the entire establishment order. Because, again, who would like really to change this order, and for what? Because most regime changes in this period are actually for the wars, to a general detriment of public authority, of overall stability. So the patrician alerted the doge, paradoxically, and when he evaded, the ducal councillors apprehended the ringleaders and, through torture, extracted a full admission exposing Faliero as the conspiracy's mastermind. Nobles, when then armed, St. Mark's Square was locked down and the doge detained, gathering at the main square and setting there a force in arms, so to prevent basically larger assemblies to take over power, to entrench in the palace, etc., was really crucial at this point. The Council of 10, charged with judging conspirators, was assembled, augmented by a zont of 20 nobles. This council, made up of 9 of the 10, a Faliero member was sidelined, by the way. The 20 additional nobles, the 6 councillors, and the 2 avogadori oversaw the trial of the doge and his accomplices, though only the 10 in councillors held voting power. And so, as early as April the 16th, 11 key figures, including the aforementioned ship Master Isarello, were hanged at the Palace Loggia. That was the public display. On the 17th, Faliero's case was deliberated, and it was ordered that he be more honorably, for Venice herself, be decapitated. So, a freeman's death, not one of a traitor really, but still on the landing where he had sworn his oath, as if to say, look, that this is the kind of power you're against, the same Venetian one. So this is so high that you cannot be treated as a normal criminal. You still maintain that traditional aura that comes with having become doge in the first place, but essentially we are the same ones who made you so, and now you screwed up and you'll be beheaded. In fact, the same day, stripped of his ducal cap, that was an important symbolism, after all, he was put to death. Right? You essentially decapitate the man, not the institution. That was important, of course. The executioner brandished the blood-stained sword from the palace loggia to the crowd, proclaiming, "Look all, justice has been dealt to the traitor." And traditor in Latin is literally like he who gives, right, who passes something from someone to another, like it would have had to happen in this case. So in the later painted and restored series of Doge's portraits in the palace, in the Doge Palace in St. Mark's Square, a black veil was placed where Faliero's image should be, and remains there, in fact, if you visit it, inscribed with a note of his punishment. This gives you a dimension, again, of how relevant such power struggles were, especially in such a close-knit community like the Venetian one, and how successful, after all, we will see it surely better in other videos, in an age of conspiracies and coups and political instability in general, Venice could resist. And it was just like a blow after another. We've seen it with Tiepolo, we will see it with what happened with the War of Chioggia, like from a military point of view, and Carmagnola, etc. Venice was incredibly stable, unlike most European powers out there, possibly more than any other, telling the truth, which would be interesting to analyze. And this is a bit like the main character of Venice during this era, consolidating a very rigid, formal, clear, distinct, ordered regime and governmental system that are particularly self-aware of the situation and manage basically to save the situation itself from these potential erosion, actually, of the government. Other Italian communes changed government systems had this continuous coup. We've seen it for many cities here very often. And this goes in parallel, in fact, with their generalized crisis at the expenses, the expenses of themselves and at the benefit of, in fact, greater powers like the same Venice. Right? Venice will also handle matters very, very brutally at some point herself when expanding on the terra firma, etc. Although, for example, on that occasion, maintaining a great deal of autonomies, not seeking to uniform the entire governmental system like the Milanese were doing, for example. So it's different. We should point out that Venice had not had up to that point, in fact, a real territorial state, so that partially explains it as well. But it's also a matter of generalized control over the center that is ultimately the one from which power is coming in terms of strict political direction. So if you maintain that, you see that there is a general success. By the way, we've seen this in the video about the Battle of Caravaggio, which illustrates how tightly the Venetian government held controls on the proper direction of military campaigns. In that sense, by that point, especially in the age of Condottieri, was not perhaps the time. In fact, they lost in that case, but that is also actually a symptom of a strong generalized control on your broader assets and, say, the general success of your policy, as a matter of fact. Now, Venetian history is amazing. We don't talk about this often. As I said at the beginning of the video, I am looking forward to make many more videos about the same. It's really one of those topics that you must want to study, to know. And these are the best chances, really. Like if you're interested in the broader topic, the channel itself is essentially what you need. Like, because we'll get into this pretty thoroughly, right? So there is no doubt, at least as far as that direction is concerned. We're going to really look at this pretty thoroughly. That's what we really want to do. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.